Welcome to episode 313 of Comment with me, George Galloway, here on Press TV, still the voice of the voiceless. Comment is the big conversation. It's the great debate. But it can only be either if you join in. That's why, above all, I need your telephone calls. The number to dial is 44208-601-4555. You call us, we'll call you back, establish a clear line, and remember, if you get on the television with me, the volume on your television has to be at 0, or I'll have to pass swiftly on. You can SMS the show on 447800008066, or you can email me at comment@presstv.co.uk. This being 2014, you can even send me a tweet. The address there is comment_presstv. Now, you made the right decision tuning in to Comment this evening, because the opening ceremonies of World Cups are always a terrible bore, and the first game is always a boring 0-0 or even 1-1 draw. So it's going to be much more exciting watching this show rather than turning over. I hope many of you are doing so. There is only one subject tonight, and it's kind of obvious. There was no al-Qaeda in Iraq, just like there were no weapons of mass destruction before George Bush and Tony Blair illegally invaded and occupied it. But there is now. In fact, there are thousands of al-Qaeda in Iraq now from all over the world. And they're not just in Iraq, they are shuttling back and forward between the west of Iraq and the east of Syria. That's significant for a number of reasons. Because the al-Qaeda offshoot, ISIS, the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, or ISIL as they previously called themselves, the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant, a remarkably Orientalist title. Maybe that's why they're trying to change it. But once upon a time, ISIL or ISIS were just a chapter of al-Qaeda in Syria. Now, this is a significant point because they have been expelled from al-Qaeda by its leader, Ayman al-Zawahiri, for being, and I quote, too sectarian, too extreme. I've seen nothing that makes me disbelieve him. I believe that this group are head-chopping, throat-cutting, heart and lung-eating, Takfiri fanatics of such virulent extremism that no sane human being would want to be within 500 miles of them. Unfortunately for the people of Iraq, that's proving rather difficult to be. Because this group, having held parts of Fallujah, most of Fallujah, and parts of Ramadi, most of Ramadi, for the last 6 months or more, have suddenly burst into the headlines, burst onto the floor of the United Nations Security Council with a military advance of stunning and deadly seriousness. They have captured some of the most historic, some of the most populous cities in Iraq, in Mosul and in Tikrit, and now they are battling for Samarra, beyond which lies Baghdad. They have taken whole regions, Nineveh, the historic and biblical place being one of those. It has been an easy advance because of the performance of the Iraqi armed forces, which were pitiful to say the least. 30,000 soldiers ran away in Mosul from 800 terrorist fanatics. And the cost of that is not just the 500,000 people who had to flee Mosul, hundreds of thousands of whom are still sleeping by the side of the road without water or food and with nowhere that they can easily flee to. Not just in the devastating blow to the integrity, territorial integrity of Iraq as a state, but because the terrorists broke into the bank and stole $460 million, which they quickly shuttled across the border into those parts of Syria that they still control. And the weaponry and equipment that was abandoned by the panicking and fleeing Iraqi soldiers has equally been distributed between ISIL in both Iraq and Syria. This is a deadly new twist. Of course, these people already had lots of money, and they already had lots of weapons and equipment. We know that because we supplied it. Britain and the United States and France and other countries have been piling money and weapons into Syria for the last 3 years. Even if they did not, and that's questionable, give it directly to the al-Qaeda outfits, that's immaterial, a distinction without a difference, because the al-Qaeda outfits promptly took it off the people Britain and the United States had given it to. So the earlier parts of this revolt in the western deserts of Iraq were being armed and financed by the chapter of ISIL that operates mainly in Syria. But now they have literally hundreds of millions of dollars and all the weaponry and material, including tanks and aircraft, that they could possibly wish for. And so we must examine more closely who they are. And I'm afraid there's no hiding place for anybody in this. There are people who, for their own reasons, wish to downplay ISIL's relationship with al-Qaeda. They're no longer in al-Qaeda, they say, as if that were a badge of honor. But they're only no longer in al-Qaeda because al-Qaeda kicked them out because, in the words of Zawahiri, they were too sectarian and too extreme. Some say that the tribes, Sunni Muslim tribes in the west of Iraq, have joined this revolt. That is, to an extent, true. Some say that the military genius that has been involved in this dramatic series of victories comes from former officers of the army of the previous Ba'athist regime in Iraq. That's also, to an extent, true. Some say this is an authentic popular uprising against the failures of the al-Maliki government in Baghdad. And that is also, to an extent, true. But the dominant force in this military sweep is ISIL. Make no mistake about that. And I have just been listening to their broadcast this evening, and this is what it said. It said, roll up your sleeves, hold this territory that you have liberated, and never allow a Shiite to set foot on this territory again. It said, we are headed for Baghdad, and we are headed further than Baghdad. We are headed for the Shiite holy shrines in Najaf and Karbala. This is the language of the most red in blood stained Takfiri fanatic. If this force that's sweeping everything before it had any redeeming qualities, the last thing in the world they would be doing is broadcasting their horrific, blood-curdling, sectarian threats. They would be calling on the people of Baghdad, the people of the south, the people of Najaf and Karbala to also rise up and join with them. But they don't, and they won't, because their purpose is not to deal with any failings of al-Maliki. It's not to deal with any issues of foreign occupation of the country. No, it is blind sectarian hatred. Don't tell me it's not, because I've just been listening to them in the last 2 hours. So who's behind them? Well, in a way, they no longer need anybody behind them. They've got all that's behind them, and they've got it in their pockets. But there is no doubt that that old chestnut, Saudi Arabia, is deeply involved with these people. Other Persian Gulf countries are involved in them, are with them. And what's the attitude going to be of Britain and the United States? Are they going to invade Iraq again? You bet they won't. Are they going to leave Iraq to fall apart, they having broken it, shattered it in the first place? You bet they will. And then there's the issue of the Kurds in the northern part of Iraq, who, seeing an opportunity this day, have now captured the oil-rich city of Kirkuk, without which an independent Kurdish state in the north of Iraq is economically unviable. So who are the losers? Apart from all the obvious, the Arabs in Iraq have now lost one of the 2 oil fields in their country. So if ISIL did manage ever, God forbid, to set up a sectarian emirate, it would be literally a desert with no economic or financial wherewithal. Doesn't sound like a plan to me. Let's see if it does to Al in Sweden. Al, who's behind all this? Who benefits from all this? Go ahead.
Hello, Mr. Galloway. I hope you're fine. Thank you for accepting my call today.
You're welcome.
Of course, we are both sure that the usual sides are the ones behind this problematic right now. But we have to know that this is a problem of 2 sides. It's not anymore only the problems of al-Qaeda or Daesh or this ISL. It is also the problem of our government in Iraq. It has become a copy of the old dictatorship. The problem is this government doesn't have any experience in the military fields whatsoever. And we are seeing this army now being almost destroyed. The army which used to frighten other countries, the army which used at least to be able to say we could defend ourselves. As you might know, there were 150,000 members altogether to be ready for any kind of attack 2 days ago. But they were afraid of 1,500 Daesh people. I think you know about these numbers too.
Yeah.
I think it's also important that everybody hears about it. And sadly, it is our government that a lot of people now are backing from supporting. We have supported it in the beginning, and we will not do it anymore, sadly, because there is no experience in the military field at all. These soldiers and the Iraqi soldiers have an experience in the war, but not in the street gang fighting, probably, or I don't know how they call it in English.
Guerrilla warfare, yeah?
Guerrilla war, exactly. So this is actually a big problem for us, because, of course, right now we have to unite and be against these terrorists and these groups that are coming into Iraq. But we have to know that they chose the right time, especially after the elections, and they know that a lot of people have a lot of disagreements with the current government and a lot of sides, and I mean by that probably more than 80%, probably. So that is our big problem right now. We have the problems from 2 sides.
Well, I think that's a very powerful and measured contribution, and I don't disagree with it. It turns out that all the billions of dollars the American taxpayer spent on so-called training of the Iraqi army was wasted money. That's if it ever actually arrived at the Iraqi army. Perhaps that's if it even arrived in Iraq, because there's now lots of evidence of agencies and individuals of the United States government themselves stealing huge sums of the American taxpayers' money. If it arrived, when it arrived in Iraq, no doubt a very great deal of it was then stolen by the political class. But whatever was spent on training the Iraqi army was clearly money wasted. And the numbers you have given are the numbers I understand to be true. The criticisms you make about al-Maliki are clearly being made by many people, including many Shiite politicians. Al-Jafari, for example, the first Prime Minister of post-war Iraq, held a meeting all day in his residence yesterday, and all sorts of people were coming and going. There are clearly events underway in Iraq, because when a Prime Minister loses a very substantial part of his country, when his army performs so miserably, then his own position must, of course, come into question. What's needed in Iraq now is what's always been needed, and that is a genuinely broadly based and multi-party government of national unity. And though that's what this government and the one before all called themselves, none of them actually were. I pray that it's not too late, that Iraq is not a lost cause, because that would be the greatest crime of all and the greatest jewel in the crown of the Crusader alliance that invaded and helped to destroy Iraq. Al in Sweden, thanks for getting us off to a good start. Let's go to Gary in Halifax, Nova Scotia. Gary, welcome.
Good evening, George.
Evening to you, sir.
These developments in Iraq are further evidence in case anyone was in any doubt about the gravity of the U.S. war crime, the Anglo-U.S. war crime committed in invading and occupying Iraq. This was a defining moment in this new century that we're in, and now we see some of the damage that is being harvested, because these Takfiri, whatever you want to call them, gangsters, they have their agenda, and they have the ear of the United States, and they have the tacit support of the Anglo-American alliance, and they will go ahead to realize their aims, and the U.S. and Britain are urging them on, because at the moment it serves a number of their aims, and the basic thing they want is to have a zillion and one Islamic caliphates and no united Arab front against the Anglo-American plan.
Well, that may very well be true. Let me deal with it part by part, Gary. I expected last night some humility from the commentators and journalists who had cheered us into this utterly disastrous, catastrophic enterprise in Iraq in 2003. I expected Tony Blair to be running away from cameras as people pursued him to ask him if now that al-Qaeda appears on the brink of power in Iraq, al-Qaeda on the brink of power in Iraq, he any longer defended the crimes that he had committed. I expected that. Instead, what I found was that the Western media, reflecting currents in the political class, is blaming Obama for having left Iraq prematurely. So this persuaded me that actually the international power is not clear or sure about what to do in this situation. They are afraid of these people heading into Baghdad, a full-scale civil war, because there's not a single Shiite in this ISIL army. There's not a single Christian. There's not a single Turkoman or any other ethnic or religious minority or sect or majority. It's just one narrow, fanatic, al-Qaeda-ish interpretation of one of the streams of Islam. That's all. Therefore, if they enter Baghdad, if, God forbid, they march on to Karbala and Najaf, they will be met by millions of Shiites under arms, which can only mean a raging sectarian civil war in Iraq, in Syria. And what next? That's why I tweeted just the other night that something big has shifted and begun to slide. And no one knows where that slide is going to end. Let's go to Baba in Botswana on the same subject. Baba, welcome to the show, my friend. Baba?
Hello?
Yes, go on,
Hello,
you're on the air.
Yeah, it's Baba in Botswana.
Go on, sir, go on.
I think this problem that we have in Iraq is a problem that's common in most Islamic countries. I don't know what the problem is really, because this loss of life and devastation of property is a real big concern. For example, if you look at the problem that we have in Iraq, it's a similar problem to the problem that we have in Syria, Yemen, Libya. The list just goes on, Somalia, Nigeria. So my question is that, George, what really causes this problem in Islamic countries? Because we have these Takfiri groups like ISIL, we have al-Nusra, we have Boko Haram, we have al-Shabaab. Who is behind all these groups? It means that there is somebody or there are some forces that are trying to destabilize Islamic countries. And having said that, initially, when the governments, like when Saddam was overthrown, when Gaddafi were overthrown, they were overthrown so that the claim was that the West wanted to bring democracy to these countries. Now we see that there is no democracy. Now there is distraction. There is chaos in these countries. So maybe you'll clarify some of these issues for me.
Well,
so
you're asking me the question. I was asking you. Here's my answer. There's no time, unfortunately, for you to give yours now. And it's this. Saudi Arabia is, of course, heavily behind all these extremist Takfiri groups, even though the ultimate target of these groups is them. And it's partly an insurance policy that if you give them enough and keep them busy enough, then they'll stay away from you. But of course, Iraq is the neighbor of Saudi Arabia. And given the military progress of this group in just the last few days, with many more days of this story still to run, I cannot understand why the Saudi dictatorship imagines that it's making itself safer as a result of arming and financing these organizations. And of course, this very organization is being backed in Syria by Western countries. Never mind the Persian Gulf money that is being poured into these organizations in Syria. British and American taxpayers, French taxpayers, French ministries of defense, special forces and trainers have all been involved in bolstering this monster, which is now broken free. Now I need to take a very short break for a news bulletin. We're discussing Iraq, of course, and God willing, I'll be back in just 3 minutes' time. So don't go away, don't switch over. I promise you the opening match of the World Cup is definitely not worth watching. The second half of Comment, God willing, will be. See you shortly. Welcome back to episode 313 of Comment with me, George Galloway, here on Press TV. Still the voice of the voiceless and giving voice to people all over the world to comment on the extraordinary events of the last days in Iraq. And let's go to Germany. Amir Salam in Germany on the subject of the ISIL military offensive that's taking place in Iraq and who's behind it and who will benefit from it. Amir Salam, welcome.
Peace be upon you, George. God's blessing and mercy.
Ameen. Thank you very much.
Peace be upon everybody who is watching this show and listening to it.
Thank you, brother.
In the name of God, the most compassionate and merciful. I think in order to solve the problem, the Iraqi government needs to do three things. First of all, they should try to start a marketing campaign in order to increase the fighting spirit of the government. Because I've been in Iraq by myself, and I know that they are well equipped and they have enough men and enough capacity to fight them back. It's just a moral aspect. The second thing they should do is to unite with the YPG, with the Kurds, and put away differences they might have. And the third thing they should do is to try to gain help from international partners like Iran and whoever can help them, military, financially, and with advice.
Well, of course, we are looking for suggestions about the way forward. Let me critique, if I may, the three suggestions that you have made. The question of fighting spirit, I'll grant you, is everything. But when 30,000 soldiers run away from 800 fighters who are far less well armed and trained and equipped than they are, this betrays not just a lack of fighting spirit. This betrays, as many parliamentarians are saying in Baghdad this evening, actual cowardice or worse, betrayal. Because it's inconceivable that such numbers confronting each other could lead to the kind of rout that happened in Mosul, for example, which of course not just had the obvious consequences, but the indirect consequences of now having provided a vast treasure trove for these Takfiris and a vast expansion of their military capacity. And whether you can put backbone back into an army so bereft of it is a very open question. Secondly, let me deal with the issue of the alliance with the Kurds. I think it's a given, I don't think anyone seriously doubts it, that it is the intention one day of the Kurdish political parties to break away from Iraq and establish a Kurdish state. There was one thing, or two really, that were holding them back from already doing so. The first was they did not control Kirkuk, which, as you know, is the center of one of Iraq's two giant oil fields. Well, now they do control Kirkuk. The Iraqi army ran away from Kirkuk, and rather than see al-Qaeda take it over, the Kurdish Peshmerga have themselves taken it over, and I don't believe they're ever going to leave it. And that provides every incentive for the Kurds to see the Arabs weaken themselves, weaken each other vis-a-vis them, so that they're much less likely ever to have to fight a major battle to hold on to Kirkuk. And whilst the third point you make is obviously superficially attractive, there are major problems with it. If Iran enters the war, this will further sectarianize the problem, which will make it absolutely impossible for any alliance between the government in Baghdad, any government in Baghdad, and the ordinary people, not the Takfiris, the ordinary people, the tribes, the Sunni Muslim population of the west of Iraq. And if they ask for an invasion from Britain and the United States, well, first of all, that's very unlikely to happen. Secondly, nobody like me could possibly, in their wildest dreams, support it. Indeed, I would have to use all the breath that God gave me to oppose it. And Stop the War would be back in business all over the world. And in any case, I don't believe that Obama or Cameron, for a minute, are going to put soldiers into this war. And lastly, and I want your view on this, I'm beginning to half suspect that Western governments may have given a green light to this Takfiri advance and assault. What do you say? Amir Salam? That's a pity, because I wanted a viewpoint on that. Let's talk to Farida in London. She's always worth hearing. Welcome, Farida.
Good evening, George.
Good evening to you. Go ahead.
When a country is plunged into mayhem and bloodshed, whoever has created it has to take full responsibility for this. And I do not mean the Americans and the British forces. This, to me, has got shades of a proxy war between Iran and Saudi Arabia. I might be wrong. You can correct me on that. As far as the young generation is concerned, who have been brought up on a diet of bloodshed, chaos, and sectarian feelings that they don't understand themselves, how dare countries like Saudi Arabia and Iran use Iraq as a battleground for their agendas? Am I being too far?
I have to disagree with you, and not because I'm on Press TV, because I think you know me well enough. I would never say something that I didn't believe, and I would seldom refrain from saying something that I did believe. If I thought you were right, I would say so. I don't believe that Iran is in any sense using Iraq. In fact, the danger for Iran now is that it gets drawn into a major conflagration in its next door neighbor, because it cannot allow the slaughter of its co-religionists, and it cannot allow a devastating war to take place on its own border, because how long before that spilled across its border? Saudi Arabia is undoubtedly involved. There's no question about that. And they wouldn't even deny that. They are not only supporting these fanatics in Syria, they are denouncing everyone else, even the United States, for not joining them wholeheartedly enough in supporting this force. And as the name suggests, this is a cross-border organization. It is the Islamic Society of Iraq and the Levant, or the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria. They're not making any bones about it. It does what it says on the tin. It's not trying to deceive us in any way. It is trying to destroy Syria and destroy Iraq in order to make what it calls an Islamic State out of as much of both of them that they can seize and hold. Saudi Arabia is backing that for reasons I adumbrated earlier. But I'm not sure that it's not going to backfire on them very spectacularly indeed. Farida, what's your answer? Who do you think is behind all this?
My answer to that is that if you say Iran has got nothing of interest in Iraq, Saudi Arabia, on the other hand, you know, in whatever agenda that they might be following, have exactly the same story to tell. They are saying that the so-called puppet regime that the West put into Iraq was being very unfair to the Sunnis. So this sectarian Sunni-Shia thing, for as long as those flames are being constantly fanned by the Western people, and we as Muslims are stupid enough to play their game by their rules, then who is going to be the loser? We are. Well,
I think the key point in response to what you've just said is this. This is my view. It's not the view of anybody else. It's not the view of Iran. It's mine. None of the governments since the Iraq war have done nearly enough to try to recreate an Iraqi national consciousness and identity. The United States and Britain have done everything they could to sectarianize politics in Iraq, and now they're complaining about it. The Maliki government has clearly failed in winning allies and friends in the Sunni population of Iraq. Otherwise, 800 fighters would not be able to advance across hundreds, maybe thousands of miles. The western part of Iraq, which they hold, is mainly desert, but it's bigger than Greece. It's huge. And the tribes there are clearly giving at least tacit support to these Takfiris. So somebody in Baghdad's going to have to take a hold of this situation. And if they want to call me, I'll give them some private suggestions of what they could do. But somebody has to take hold of it. It will not be able to be resolved just by military force. In fact, if Iran is forced, and it might be, and I could not complain if it was, dragged into this conflict, then the sectarianization will be complete. But not only does Iran not want to be drawn into this conflict, they are the ones with least to gain from this conflict. Saudi Arabia, on the other hand, is the center of terror international. From 9/11, before 9/11, after 9/11. Saudi Arabia is filled with people whose heart beats to the drum of sectarian hatred. That's the reality, Farida. Thanks for the call. Let's go to Abdi. He's in Canada, in Toronto. Abdi, welcome. Abdi? Unfortunately, we've lost that call. We are talking about the extraordinary events of the last few days in Iraq, where from a period of 3 months or so, Takfiri fanatics have held most of Fallujah, most of Ramadi, and established a no-go area for the government in Baghdad in large parts of western Iraq. And that has been transformed in just a few days to shells this afternoon landing at Baghdad airport. And an army driving Toyotas that they took from the so-called moderate opposition in Syria, given to them by Britain, France, and the United States. A column, a military column, has now circumnavigated Samarra and is within a couple of hundred miles, at the very most, maybe 100 at the closest, to the Iraqi capital, Baghdad. And in a blood-curdling message, which I just listened to before the show, from their chief spokesman, they made it clear that they were bent upon sectarian murder and mayhem. Abdul in Toronto is back. Abdul, welcome. Abdi, I beg your pardon, Abdi. Go ahead.
It's all the same, George. Good evening. How are you? By the grace of God, I'm good. Thank you. Go ahead. Yes, I'm heartbroken to see this ISIL Takfiris, wherever they're from. These videos that have emerged of them gunning people down, it's very horrific. And I hear you say that Iran does not want to be involved in the affairs of its neighbors. I tend to disagree, George. I think Iran is able to do a big favor, if not at least, boots on the ground, but some tactical support. I think these people, if they're chased, should be chased all the way down to wherever they came from, whether it's Saudi, Chechnya. I mean, it doesn't make sense, for people to be killed on a daily basis in Syria and in Iraq, and we get to watch this while America and Britain have taken their boots home safely, right?
No, of course I understand it might come to that, Abdi. Nobody could blame Iran if it did. But Iranian foreign policy has been clear for centuries. Iran has not invaded anybody else's territory for more than 300 years. I wish I could say the same about my own country. It's hardly 3 years since Britain last invaded somebody else's territory. Iran is led by wise people who know the sectarian tinderbox that exists in Iraq and does not want to add to it. I happen to believe, I have no privileged information, I assure you, I happen to believe that Iran has been concerned for some considerable time at the lack of progress the government in Baghdad was making at making alliances outside and out with its own sectarian bases. And whoever's going to be in charge in Iraq now, and the parliament was inquorate today, therefore no state of emergency has been able to be declared, and neither has al-Maliki been confirmed as Prime Minister, and may now never be confirmed as Prime Minister. But whoever emerges in the center, in power, they're going to have to work very hard to try to isolate the Chechens and others who are in this ISIS from the Iraqi component of it and deal on a negotiated basis with the Iraqis. They are Iraqi citizens, whether they are Sunni or Shia, whether they are supporters of the government or not. They are Iraqis who have to be dealt with and have to be brought somehow into the tent. I've got ideas on that. I don't want to expand on them on the screen. But what do you think should happen now, Abdi?
Well, what I think should happen, it's very clear. I believe that since America and Britain has left Iraq devastated and left it to these terrorists, Iran needs to get involved. I'm not saying maybe if their policy is not to get involved, but this is their neighborhood. This is very far away from the shores of Britain and the U.S. This is in Iran's backyard. And they need to give Iraq some assistance, whether it's tactical or boots on the ground, and the sooner the better. I believe this would. So if other countries don't like it, so be it. But this is the neighborhood for Iran, and I think they have a moral responsibility, a religious responsibility to go and defend the defenseless people of Iraq from these.
But why are they defenseless? The United States taxpayer expended scores of billions of dollars to arm and train the military forces of Iraq. Why are they defenseless?
Well, I'm saddened actually that they were fooled, George, by aid. Like I don't know where you get the numbers that 10,000 Iraqi troops ran away from
30,000
terrorists.
30,000.
30,000. That's just very shocking to me. I mean, I don't know the so-called training that the U.S. has been providing for the many years they were there, but how did it come to this is the question, and how are these people able to drive down in regular roads and gun down people recklessly? And I believe that the international community...
Trust me on this, Abdi. You'll see exactly the same thing in Afghanistan after the Western forces withdraw from there. All the billions that were spent on training and weapons of the Karzai forces will quickly melt into air. Let's go to Ogashuwa in Nigeria. Ogashuwa, who's behind it all, in your opinion?
Doctor of Iraq. Yes,
go ahead.
The sectarian in Iraqi city. The terrorists. Hello?
Yes, go on. You're on the air.
Hello. Good day, George Galloway.
Good evening to you. Go ahead, sir.
Good evening, sir. How are you?
By the grace of God, good, but you're running out of time, so be quick.
Thank you. Okay. Sir, what I want to say this evening is that those people that are behind this thing is rather that no other people that Saudi Arabia, American, France, because they were being donated a huge amount of money, pretending deceiving the people of the world in the name of their supporting the Syrian rebels. And this, it has not brought back. The essence of it is to destabilize the Middle East. But the most fortunate aspect of it, why Muslim
listen, brother, call us back next week because I can't follow you, I'm afraid. It's a very poor line. Let's finish with another African caller, John in Ethiopia. Who's behind it all, John?
Yeah.
Yeah, go on.
Yeah. I just wanted to talk about the crisis in Iraq and in Ukraine.
Yeah. Well, stick to Iraq. You've only got 2 minutes. Stick to Iraq. Go on.
Okay. And I just wanted to say that I think that it's the Western powers who are supplying the terrorists and the Takfiri militants in both Iraq and Syria. And I think that is going to backfire. It's going to be a boomerang effect on the United States of America. Hello. Can you hear me?
So you think it's the Western powers who are behind this?
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
And I think that when it's going to backfire on the Western powers, and I think that the East has to have a tough stance on the Western powers.
Well, look, I'll tell you what, John. To some extent, the West is definitely behind it because they're backing this Takfiri phenomenon in Syria next door, and this is a cross-border Syrian Iraqi terrorist group. But whether they're directly assisting this current military push is more questionable. But it is arguable, it is debatable, and it's giving me food for thought. Watch this space as issues and matters develop. It's been marvelous for me. I hope it was for you. If so, next week, inshallah.
Hello, if you just comment your name and the place you got that number. And just make sure that your television volume's set to 0. So 0. Can you spell your name for me? Yeah, I know. You redirect me put through your phone number and then we'll call you back. Comment.